Austin, Texas, 7:04 a.m. Ethan Cole liked his mornings quiet, calculated, and completely under control. By 7 a.m. sharp, he was on his usual route through Zilker Park, earbuds in, double-shot espresso in one hand, stride steady and unhurried. On paper, he had everything a man could want. Founder and former CEO of HyderTech, a billion-dollar AI firm. Board seats on 2 Fortune 500 companies. A penthouse overlooking the city skyline. And a face that still made the occasional magazine cover. At 42, Ethan had mastered the art of projecting success. But no one ever asked him who he texted at midnight, or why his refrigerator held nothing but sparkling water and a half-used bottle of almond milk. This was the life he built, structured, polished, untouchable, and most days it suited him just fine. Today wasn't most days. The air held a bite of late winter, the kind of morning where breath hung visibly in the air and joggers bundled up in thin layers they'd regret after 10 minutes of movement. Ethan wore his usual black track jacket, perfectly fitted, and his favorite pair of noise-canceling earbuds, because silence to him had always felt safer than small talk. He passed the same people every day, the man with the golden retriever who nodded but never smiled, the elderly woman feeding the birds near the footbridge, the teenage girl in a hoodie dancing more than jogging. They were part of his morning theater, background to his own performance of routine and control. He didn't know their names, didn't want to. Connection, Ethan had learned, had a cost, and in his world, nothing came free. As he neared the far bench by the duck pond, one he usually ignored, something stopped him. A flicker, a shadow. Someone was slumped over on the bench, body curled, shoulders sagging like an emptied sack. 2 small figures sat at her feet, motionless. Ethan slowed. It wasn't the stillness that pulled him in, it was the silence around them. No one noticed. A cyclist zipped past, a jogger barely glanced over. But Ethan, he stopped. There was something about the scene that didn't fit. The woman's head was tilted unnaturally, her hands limp in her lap. The boys, twins, maybe 4 or 5, sat pressed together like bookends, barefoot despite the chill, eyes puffy and red. One of them looked up, and Ethan felt something twist, sharp and deep, like a wire pulling tight in his chest. Those eyes, that hair. He took a step closer, then another. The woman wasn't just sleeping. Her skin was pale, lips slightly parted. She looked hollowed out, the kind of exhaustion no coffee or nap could fix. He crouched beside her, voice low. "Ma'am?" Nothing. He touched her shoulder, cool to the touch, breathing but shallow. He reached for his phone. As he dialed 911, one of the boys spoke, barely a whisper. She was tired. She said she just wanted to rest a little. The other boy leaned closer to his brother, his voice cracking. "We were waiting for Daddy, but he didn't come." Ethan stared. The boy's words landed like a stone. They had his eyes. Not metaphorically, literally. Blue-gray, flecked with something stormy around the edges. Hair like his as a child. Dark, unruly curls that refused to lie flat. Even the curve of their chins mirrored his own. "I'll stay with you," Ethan said quietly, not sure who he was speaking to. The boys. Himself. Maybe her. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Questions came fast. Names, relation, how long they'd been here. Ethan answered what he could. Her name? He didn't know. How did he find them? Morning run. Was he their father? He opened his mouth, closed it. Then finally, I think I might be. The boys didn't flinch. They each took one of his hands like they'd done it 1,000 times before. Ethan didn't hesitate when the ambulance doors opened. He followed. Because for all the things in his life he could calculate, stock options, IPO returns, buyout clauses, this moment didn't fit. and that made it the most real thing he'd felt in years. As they drove to the hospital, one boy curled against his side, the other held his coat tight around his shoulders. Ethan stared out the window and wondered, for the first time in a long time, what the hell he'd been chasing all these years. He had everything, except maybe the one thing that mattered. And as he looked down at those two boys, wide-eyed and wordless beside him, he had the terrifying, unshakable feeling that his entire life was about to change. Forever. St. David's Medical Center, 8:30 a.m. The hospital waiting room was too bright, too cold, too full of silence that Ethan Cole didn't know how to sit inside. He shifted on the hard plastic chair, fingers laced tight, elbows braced on his knees. Across the room, a monitor beeped steadily behind a curtained partition. Down the hall, the low hum of nurses changing shifts drifted toward him. But here, in this corner, everything felt suspended. The boys, Liam and Noah, the intake nurse had told him, slept curled together on a cot, Ethan's coat draped across their small bodies. He hadn't left their side since the ambulance. He hadn't wanted to. For a man used to cutting through contracts, orchestrating million-dollar deals before breakfast, Ethan had never felt so unsure. What was he supposed to do now? He barely knew how to talk to children, let alone two who might, no, almost certainly were, his own. And Sophie. God, Sophie. He hadn't seen her in 6 years. A sharp ache pulled in his chest at the memory of her name. Sophie Bennett, the woman he'd once called his match, his partner, the only person who had ever made him want something beyond the next big deal. They had burned fast, bright, too intense for their own good. And when his company took off, when the demands multiplied, when investors called at midnight, when IPO prep consumed every second, he'd chosen the chase over her. She hadn't begged him to stay. She hadn't slammed doors or thrown ultimatums. She had simply disappeared. Until now. The sound of a nurse's shoes approaching snapped him from the fog. "Mr. Cole?" He straightened, his body tensing before he even registered why. "She's stable," the nurse said gently, a soft kindness in her eyes. "Dehydrated, exhausted, but she's going to be okay." Ethan exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. "Can I?" "She's not awake yet, but soon." He nodded, pushing to his feet on legs that felt surprisingly unsteady. "Thank you." The nurse gave him a soft smile before glancing toward the boys. "They've been asking for her, and you." Ethan's throat tightened. He crossed the room, crouching beside the cot. Liam stirred first, rubbing his eyes with a small fist, his dark lashes damp and stuck together. Noah shifted next, mumbling softly under his breath. Ethan reached out, hesitated, then smoothed a hand lightly over Liam's hair. "She's going to be okay," he said, voice rough, foreign even to his own ears. Liam blinked up at him. "Are you really our dad?" The question cracked something open in Ethan's chest. He could have dodged. He could have said he didn't know, that he needed time, that a test was coming, but none of those answers would mean anything to a 5-year-old boy in a too-big hospital cot. "I think I am," Ethan whispered. Liam stared at him for a long beat, as if measuring the words in his small heart. Then, without a word, he shifted closer, pressing his forehead lightly to Ethan's knee. For a moment, Ethan just sat there, hands frozen in his lap, feeling the fragile weight of that trust settle over him like a blanket he wasn't sure he deserved. And for the first time, maybe in his entire adult life, he let himself sit in that space, not trying to fix it, not trying to outrun it. Just present. 2 hours later, Sophie woke. Ethan stood outside her door, one hand braced on the frame, unsure whether to go in. His heart thudded hard enough that he half wondered if the nurses would check him next. When the nurse motioned him forward, He stepped inside quietly. The woman in the hospital bed was both familiar and foreign. Sophie looked thinner than he remembered, cheeks hollowed by exhaustion, hair tangled across the pillow, lips pale. But her eyes, when they fluttered open, still held that same fierce spark that had once drawn him in like a moth to a flame. "I guess you found us," she rasped, a wry twist pulling at her mouth. Ethan exhaled a sound that was almost a laugh, almost a sigh. "I wasn't looking," he admitted quietly. "But I'm here." She studied him for a long, silent moment. Then, in a voice thin but edged with steel, she whispered, "You weren't supposed to know." "I know now." Sophie closed her eyes briefly, as if bracing herself against something heavy. When she opened them again, they glimmered faintly with a sheen that nearly undid him. "They don't know who you are," she murmured. "I didn't tell them. I wasn't sure you'd care." Ethan's chest clenched so hard it stole his breath. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Finally, he asked the only question that mattered. "What do you need from me?" For a moment, Sophie didn't answer. She turned her face toward the window where the gray morning light filtered in through thin blinds. When she spoke, it was so soft he almost missed it. "Don't disappear." Ethan stepped closer, voice low, steady. "I won't." And for the first time since the world had tilted sideways in that park, Ethan felt something like purpose crack through the cold shell of his life. He had spent years chasing success. Now maybe it was time to stay, to be. And that terrified him more than any boardroom ever had. But looking at Sophie, fragile and unbroken in the hospital bed, and thinking of the two small boys curled under his coat, he knew. He was done running. The hospital's pediatric waiting room had the kind of soft, manufactured cheer that tried too hard. Faded murals of cartoon animals, plastic chairs in primary colors, a TV playing a show with tinny music that looped endlessly. Ethan sat on the edge of a chair, elbows on his knees, watching Liam and Noah huddle over a tray of untouched crackers and juice boxes. The boys were quiet now, their small bodies pressed close, eyes darting to him, then away, like they weren't sure what he'd do if they stared too long. Ethan felt the weight of their glances like a stone in his chest. His phone buzzed again. Another email. Another meeting he should have been in 2 hours ago. Another decision his board probably expected him to make. Without looking, he powered the phone off. He had more important things to figure out. The door swung open, and Maria stepped into the room like a brisk wind. Short, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, Ethan's housekeeper of 12 years had been at his side longer than most people in his life. When he'd called, voice low, unsteady, surprising even himself, she hadn't asked questions. She'd just said, "I'm coming." Maria took one look at the boys, then crossed the room with practiced efficiency, crouching in front of them. "Hola, dulces," she murmured, her Spanish soft and lilting as she tucked the boys' hair back from their faces. "You must be so tired." The boys blinked at her. Liam gave a shy, almost imperceptible nod. Noah tilted his head, evaluating, as if deciding whether she was friend or stranger. "Would you like some warm cocoa when we get home?" Maria offered gently. Noah's lip trembled. Liam gripped his brother's sleeve tighter. Ethan cleared his throat softly. "Maria, this is Liam and Noah." His voice roughened over their names. "My sons." Maria's gaze flicked up, sharp as a blade. "Your sons," she repeated softly. "Bueno." Her eyes softened. "We'll get them settled." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The apartment he arranged for Sophie and the boys wasn't his penthouse. It was a furnished 2-bedroom in a quiet building on the east side, close to the hospital, clean and practical. Ethan insisted on it, ignoring Sophie's exhausted protests. As they walked in that evening, Sophie hesitated in the doorway. She leaned on the frame, hair pulled into a loose braid, clothes wrinkled from the hospital stay. Her expression caught somewhere between gratitude and defeat. "You didn't have to do this," she murmured. Ethan rubbed a hand along the back of his neck. "I wanted to." Sophie's lips curved in the faintest, weary smile. "That's what scares me." He should have answered, but the words tangled in his throat. Instead, he watched as the boys wandered in, wide-eyed, fingers brushing the soft couch cushions and running along the windowsill. Noah peeked into the kitchen cabinets. Liam climbed carefully onto the armchair, curling his knees to his chest like a cat finding a nest. Maria appeared behind them with 2 grocery bags, her no-nonsense efficiency already turning the bare apartment into something like home. Soup on the stove, blankets draped on the backs of chairs, a light left on in the hallway for bedtime. Ethan caught Sophie watching Maria work, something tight in her face easing just slightly. "She's kind," Sophie murmured. "She's family," Ethan said quietly, surprising himself. They stood in the kitchen for a moment, the silence stretching between them. Outside the window, the city flickered to life. Headlights in neat rows, neon signs humming, the distant pulse of music rising from 6th Street. "So," Sophie folded her arms, leaning back against the counter. "What's your plan, Ethan? Sponsor the apartment? Visit when it's convenient? Get your redemption arc in the press?" The words weren't sharp, but they weren't soft either. Ethan felt the heat rise under his skin. He had always been good at reading boardrooms, sensing negotiations shift, but with Sophie it was like trying to read a language he'd long ago forgotten. "I don't have a plan," he admitted, voice low. Sophie's mouth twitched, a flicker of old amusement breaking through the exhaustion. That might be a first. He huffed a quiet laugh, ran a hand through his hair. "Yeah, well, it's been a hell of a day." The kitchen light cast a warm glow over her face, softening the sharp edges time and stress had carved there. For a moment they just stood, suspended between past and present, in the thin, fragile space of what came next. Sophie's gaze dropped. She exhaled. "I can't do this if you're going to disappear again," she murmured. "The boys, they can't." The words hit him with the weight of something more than a warning. It was a plea. A test. Ethan reached across the counter, fingers brushing the rim of a chipped mug Maria had unearthed. "I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time, he realized he meant it. Outside, the city roared on. Inside, the quiet, messy, terrifying beginnings of something new took root. The apartment smelled faintly of soup and laundry soap, 2 small but unmistakable signs that life was beginning to stir in a space meant only to be temporary. Ethan leaned against the doorframe of the boys' bedroom, arms crossed loosely over his chest, watching as Liam lined up toy cars on the windowsill, and Noah bounced on the twin bed, giggling with every bounce. Maria's grocery bags sat half unpacked on the kitchen counter, the rhythmic clatter of her moving around providing a quiet backdrop to the apartment's soft chaos. Sophie was sitting on the edge of the second twin bed, smoothing the rumpled blanket with one hand, her profile outlined against the warm lamplight. There was something delicate and fiercely tired in the set of her shoulders, like a woman holding herself together by sheer will. Ethan cleared his throat softly. Sophie looked up, her eyes skimming over him warily before softening. "They should wind down soon," she said, though her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who knew bedtime was still at least an hour away. Ethan stepped in, the floor creaking faintly under his weight. "They're good kids." He hesitated, a rare crack in his polished armor. You've done a hell of a job with them." Sophie gave a short, breathy laugh, but it wasn't bitter. It hasn't been pretty, Ethan. You're seeing the highlight reel tonight. She rubbed her temples. There were nights I didn't know how we'd get through the week, or the day, and now you're here and I don't even know what to do with that. Ethan wanted to say me neither. He wanted to say, I'm sorry. But the words jammed in his throat, a lifetime of deflection fighting to stay in place. Instead, he sat carefully on the small desk chair in the corner. Liam peered at him shyly, holding up a battered red car. Noah flopped dramatically across his pillow and grinned. We don't usually have visitors, Liam said softly, but there was a glimmer of something hopeful in his voice. Ethan felt his heart twist. Well, maybe we should change that. The words hung in the room, heavier than he expected. Sophie watched him, her brow furrowing. Ethan, she murmured, her voice low but edged with steel. Don't make promises to them you can't keep. The sting of it hit harder than any boardroom negotiation ever had. I'm not planning on going anywhere, Ethan said quietly, holding her gaze. But I get it. You don't have a reason to believe me yet. For a long beat, they just looked at each other, the woman who had survived without him, and the man who had everything but had no idea how to stand still. Noah yawned theatrically, breaking the moment, and Sophie stood, brushing a hand across her forehead. I need a minute, she murmured, slipping past Ethan and out into the living room. Ethan hesitated, then followed. In the living room, Sophie stood at the window, arms wrapped tightly around herself, watching the lights of the city stretch out into the night. She didn't turn when he approached. You're good with them, she said softly. You didn't used to be good with anyone who couldn't help your bottom line. Ethan winced. I deserved that. A long silence stretched between them. Sophie turned then, leaning back against the windowsill, her eyes shadowed but sharp. Why now, Ethan? Why come in like this? Full tilt, no warning. You've got an empire to run, people waiting on your next move. Why not send a check and walk away? He met her gaze, feeling the old guilt, the old ache rise in his chest. Because when I saw you there, on that bench, with them, his voice roughened, I realized I'd spent so much of my life building something that didn't matter. And you? He exhaled. You built everything that did, and you did it alone. Sophie's throat worked as she swallowed hard, looking away. I didn't want your money, she whispered. That's why I never told you. I didn't want to be your charity project. You're not, Ethan said, his voice quiet but certain. You never were. For a moment, Sophie let herself lean into the softness of his words. But then, like a woman trained by survival, she straightened. I need to know, she said, her voice low and fierce, that you're not just here until this stops feeling like a rescue mission. I can't let the boys fall in love with you if you're going to disappear when it gets messy. Ethan stepped closer, feeling the distance between who he'd been and who he was trying to become. I don't know what I'm doing, he admitted, surprising them both. But I'm here, and I want to figure it out. Sophie's eyes softened, just barely. But that softness was enough to make Ethan's chest tighten with something raw, something dangerous, something that felt like hope. In the next room, a small voice called out, Mommy? Sophie turned, half smiling through the exhaustion. I should, she murmured, already stepping away. Ethan watched her go, feeling the pull of something he hadn't let himself want in years. Not control, not power, connection. And for the first time in a long, long while, Ethan Cole wasn't sure if he was terrified of falling or ready to finally let himself jump. The apartment was quiet the next morning, but not in the peaceful way Ethan had imagined. It was the kind of quiet that buzzed with tension, the kind you could feel under your skin. He stood in the small kitchen, pouring coffee into two mismatched mugs Maria had unpacked, while behind him, Sophie moved carefully through the living room, folding the thin blanket the boys had dragged off the couch during the night. Ethan could hear Liam and Noah giggling softly in their room, the occasional thump of a toy car hitting the wall. It should have been a comforting sound, but in the charged silence between him and Sophie, it only made his pulse quicken. "I have a call with the board at 9, he said, sliding one mug across the counter toward her. "I can push it." Sophie didn't look up. "You don't have to." He ran a hand over his jaw, feeling the rasp of stubble. "I want to." That finally earned him a glance. Sophie's eyes were tired, guarded, but there was something behind them now, a flicker of vulnerability, or maybe just exhaustion thinly veiled as strength. "You know," she murmured, picking up the mug without meeting his gaze, "you can't just throw money at this and expect it to fix everything." Ethan's grip tightened slightly on his own cup. "I'm not trying to fix it with money," he said quietly. Sophie huffed a laugh under her breath. "You're Ethan Cole. You fix everything with money." The words weren't cruel. They were matter of fact. The way someone states a weather forecast, they've stopped trying to fight. Ethan leaned against the counter, studying her. "I'm not the same man you left, Sophie." Her head snapped up. "I didn't leave," she said sharply. "You left. You chose late nights and mergers and a version of your life where I didn't fit." Ethan's chest went tight. He opened his mouth, then closed it. They were interrupted by the sound of little feet thundering into the kitchen. "Nick!" Noah shouted, bounding forward with a stuffed dinosaur clutched in his hand. "Want to see my T-Rex?" Ethan crouched instinctively, letting the boy crash into his side. "Absolutely," he murmured, his lips tugging into a genuine, surprised smile. "Show me everything." Sophie watched from across the room, the mug cradled between her hands, her mouth softening in spite of herself. By noon, Ethan was back on a video call, earbuds in, standing near the apartment window while the boys napped in the next room. Tasha, his sharp-eyed assistant, filled the screen. "Ethan, the media has wind of this. We're getting inquiries. They know you've been occupied." "I'm not issuing a statement," Ethan said flatly, jaw tight. Tasha arched a brow. "You sure?" "Because this is going to explode across the tech and business feeds within 24 hours. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, saw Sophie on the couch, eyes closed, one hand resting lightly on her forehead. "Let it," he murmured, more to himself than to Tasha. Tasha's voice softened just slightly. "Are you okay?" Ethan rubbed a hand over his face. "No." He ended the call without waiting for her reply. That night, as the city hummed outside the windows, Sophie sat cross-legged on the couch, her fingers absently picking at the frayed edge of a throw pillow. "Trevor called today," she said quietly, not looking up. Ethan froze in the doorway. "Trevor?" "My ex," Sophie said, voice tight. "From after you. He helped for a while. He's not their father, but he—" She shook her head. "He thinks he has some kind of say." Ethan felt something cold and instinctive rise in his chest. "What kind of say?" Sophie let out a long, shaky breath. "He wants to visit. Help with the boys." She lifted her gaze to Ethan's. "He heard you're back, and now he's interested." Ethan crossed his arms, the businessman in him clicking into place before the father or the partner. "He's not their father." "I know that," Sophie said softly. "But it's not that simple, Ethan." His voice dropped. "It is to me." Their eyes locked. For a beat, neither spoke. Then Sophie let out a tired laugh, rubbing her hands over her face. "God, we're good at this." "At what?" "At turning everything into a battle," she whispered. Ethan's arms dropped to his sides. He stepped forward, kneeling slightly to meet her eyes where she sat. "I'm not here to fight you, Sophie." Her eyes shimmered with something that looked like both longing and deep bone-weary fear. "I'm just trying to protect what's mine," Ethan said softly. Sophie let out a broken, breathy laugh. "Funny," she murmured, voice trembling. "That's exactly what I've been doing for 6 years." And this time, Ethan didn't have a clever reply, or a plan, or an exit strategy. All he had was the aching, growing awareness that if he wanted to stay, he would have to learn how to fight for something more than just control. The next morning, sunlight spilled into the apartment in long, golden bands, warming the faded wood floors and casting soft halos over scattered toy cars and crumpled coloring pages. Ethan stood at the small kitchen table, sleeves rolled, forehead furrowed as he stared at the cereal boxes lined up in front of him. "Do they want the rainbow ones or the ones shaped like stars?" he muttered under his breath. Behind him, Maria leaned on the counter, arms crossed, watching with a half-smile tugging at her mouth. "Senor Cole," she said with gentle amusement. "They are 5. Give them sugar. You will be a hero." Ethan huffed out a laugh, shaking his head. "I can negotiate a $20 million merger, but breakfast is apparently where I meet my match." Maria walked over, taking the box from his hands. "Because you can't control breakfast, or small children." Her eyes softened. "Or love." The words caught him off guard. Before he could answer, the boys barreled into the room, Noah laughing, Liam trailing quietly behind, clutching a stuffed bear under one arm. They made a beeline for Ethan, Noah latching onto his leg like it was a jungle gym, Liam pressing his face shyly into his side. "Nick, can we go to the park today?" Noah asked, words tumbling over each other in excitement. Ethan crouched, smoothing a hand over Liam's hair. "Yeah, champ, we can go." Sophie appeared in the doorway, barefoot, hair pulled into a loose ponytail, wearing a soft, worn t-shirt that made something in Ethan's chest tighten. Her arms crossed, eyes dancing with cautious humor. "Look at you," she teased, voice soft. "Father of the Year already." Ethan met her gaze, heart twisting at the warmth mixed with wariness in her eyes. "I'm trying." Her smile faded just slightly. "I know." Later, as the boys ran circles around the playground, Ethan and Sophie sat on a bench under the wide arms of an old oak tree. For a while they watched in silence, Noah climbing too high, Liam methodically collecting sticks, the occasional call of, "Mommy, Nick, look." "I talked to Trevor," Sophie said quietly. Ethan stiffened. "He wants to visit," she went on, her fingers knotting together in her lap. "He says he was there when you weren't, that he should still have a place in their lives." Ethan's jaw worked. "He didn't stay, Sophie. He left." "He left me," Sophie murmured, voice strained. "Not them. And you weren't here to see the nights he helped, or the times he brought groceries when I was short on cash." Ethan's fists curled, a hollow pressure blooming in his chest. He hated how her words chipped at the easy narrative he'd built in his head. The one where Trevor was the intruder, the outsider, the problem. "Do you want him around?" he asked, his voice low, sharper than intended. Sophie looked up, startled. Her eyes softened with a hint of sadness. "It's not about what I want. It's about what's best for them." Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "I can give them stability. I can give you—" Sophie cut him off gently. "Ethan, this isn't a competition." He let out a tight breath, feeling something in his chest buckle. "I don't know how to do this," he confessed, the words surprising even himself. "I know how to close deals. I know how to run companies, but this scares the hell out of me." Sophie's lips parted, surprise flickering across her face. "I'm not asking you to fix everything," she said softly. "I'm asking you to stay." Ethan lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm here." For a moment, the space between them hummed, charged with old wounds and new beginnings, with what had been and what might still be. Sophie's gaze dropped, her fingers brushing a lock of hair from her cheek. "That's a start," she whispered. That night, after the boys were in bed, Ethan sat at the small table, laptop open, his inbox flooded with demands from a world that suddenly felt a lifetime away. Sophie moved quietly around the apartment, picking up toys, folding a blanket, her presence like a soft heartbeat in the room. Finally, she sank onto the couch across from him, tucking her knees under her, watching him over the rim of a mug. "Are you going back?" she asked quietly. Ethan looked up. "Back where?" "To that life." The question settled between them like a delicate thread, taut and trembling. He closed the laptop slowly, his gaze steady on hers. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm not ready to leave this one yet." Sophie smiled, small, tired, but real, and for the first time since everything had upended, Ethan felt the faintest sense of peace, not because they were fixed, but because they were trying. The next few days passed in a blur of small routines and quiet adjustments. Ethan found himself waking before dawn, padding barefoot through the apartment to check on the boys, their small bodies tangled under mismatched blankets. He was surprised by how quickly his days filled, not with board calls or investor meetings, but with cereal spills, stubbed toes, and endless questions about dinosaurs and space rockets. In the quiet moments, though, when the boys were napping or Sophie was curled on the couch reading, the tension seeped back in like a low hum beneath the surface. He felt it most sharply when his phone vibrated. That afternoon, as he helped Liam tape a paper spaceship together at the kitchen table, Ethan's phone buzzed 3 times in quick succession. "Tasha." Ethan hesitated, glancing toward Sophie, who sat on the couch, her legs tucked under her, eyes flicking between the boys and a book she wasn't really reading. He swiped the screen reluctantly. Tasha's face appeared, her signature sharp bob and raised eyebrow filling the screen. "You've been off the grid," she said dryly. "I've been busy," Ethan murmured, lowering his voice as Liam pressed a glue-covered hand to his sleeve. "Busy being a domestic hero?" Tasha arched a brow. "The board's asking questions, Ethan. The press is poking around, and Trevor, yes, I know about Trevor, is stirring things up." Ethan tensed. "What do you know?" "Enough," Tasha said, her tone softening. "Look, I get it. You're trying to build something here, but you're not the only one with skin in this game. The company's rattled. And if Trevor files for visitation rights, this will turn into a circus." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'll handle Trevor," he said quietly. Tasha sighed, eyeing him carefully. "You're not the man I used to work for, Ethan. And I mean that as a compliment. Just don't lose yourself trying to prove you've changed." The screen went dark. Ethan set the phone down, his shoulders rigid. Across the room, Sophie was watching. Later that night, after the boys were asleep and Maria had quietly slipped out, Sophie found Ethan on the balcony. He stood with his hands braced on the railing, the city lights flickering below like 1,000 restless hearts. She stepped out, pulling her sweater tighter around her. "You're quiet tonight," she said softly. Ethan didn't look at her. Tasha called. Sophie leaned against the rail beside him, the night breeze tugging at her hair. "Let me guess," she murmured. "Trevor." Ethan turned, finally, his face shadowed but his eyes lit with a storm of frustration. "He's circling, Sophie. He's watching this unfold, waiting for a moment to push his way in." Sophie exhaled slowly. "He was good to them when you weren't here, Ethan. That counts for something." His fists clenched against the railing. "I don't want them confused. I don't want them thinking—" He broke off, running a hand through his hair. I don't know how to explain to them why I left, or why I'm here now. Sophie's voice softened, threading through the cold air like a balm. Start small. Ethan looked at her, brow furrowed. Tell them you're learning, Sophie said quietly. Tell them you're trying. They don't need the full story. They just need you to show up. For a long moment, they stood there in the hush of the night, the old pain flickering between them like an ember neither had quite let go of. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice raw. I can't fix what I broke, Sophie. She turned to him, her expression tired, tender. No, she murmured. But you can build something new. And in that moment, with the city stretched out before them and the weight of old choices pressing in, Ethan understood that redemption wasn't something you earned overnight. It was something you earned over and over again, one small moment at a time. The next morning, the apartment was filled with the smell of pancakes and the faint sound of cartoons. Ethan stood in the kitchen, flipping a lopsided pancake with far more focus than was necessary. Across the room, Sophie leaned against the counter, arms crossed, lips curved in an amused half-smile as she watched the spectacle unfold. I didn't realize you knew how to cook, she teased, sipping her coffee. I didn't, Ethan muttered under his breath. I'm improvising. Noah raced through the kitchen in his superhero pajamas, a blur of energy, while Liam quietly set the table, occasionally glancing up at Ethan with shy approval. It should have been a perfect Saturday morning, messy, noisy, beautifully ordinary. But under the surface, tension pulsed like a low drumbeat. Sophie set her cup down, her expression softening. Trevor called again last night. Ethan's shoulders stiffened. What does he want? He wants to come over, Sophie said quietly. He wants to see the boys. Ethan turned, spatula still in hand. Here? Yes? Here? The air in the room shifted. I don't like it, Ethan said, his voice tightening. He doesn't belong in this. Sophie exhaled slowly, tucking her hair behind her ear. He was here, Ethan, when you weren't. He stepped in when I had no one else. I'm here now, Ethan shot back too sharply. For a moment, the room held its breath. From the living room, the boys' laughter floated in, a reminder of what mattered and what was at stake. Sophie crossed the room, her voice low, urgent. Ethan, this isn't about you proving something. It's about what's best for them. Ethan braced his hands on the counter, chest tight. I'm trying, Sophie. But you're asking me to sit across from the man who raised my kids when I didn't even know they existed. Sophie's eyes softened, but she didn't back down. I'm asking you to put the boys first. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan pulled in a slow, shaky breath, forcing his fists to unclench. When? Tomorrow, Sophie murmured. Just for an hour. We'll keep it simple. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, nodding once. Okay. The next day arrived with the weight of a storm on the horizon. Trevor showed up at noon, casual, smiling, carrying a bag of puzzles and snacks. He was handsome in a clean-cut, polished way, dressed in jeans and a navy jacket, with the relaxed charm of a man used to slipping into people's lives and making himself comfortable. Ethan greeted him at the door, jaw tight, pulse thrumming in his ears. Ethan, Trevor said with an easy grin, offering a hand. Ethan shook it stiffly, feeling the force of everything unspoken in that brief contact. The boys barreled into the room, Noah throwing himself at Trevor with a delighted squeal, Liam hanging back shyly. Trevor laughed, ruffling their hair, glancing up at Sophie with a warmth that made something sharp twist in Ethan's chest. For an hour, Ethan sat on the edge of the couch, hands clenched between his knees, watching Trevor charm his sons, hearing the easy laughter, the casual familiarity. Sophie moved between the rooms, trying to bridge the space between past and present. but Ethan saw it in her, the tension in her shoulders, the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. He saw it, too, in the boys. Liam drifted toward Ethan after 20 minutes, quietly slipping onto the arm of the couch, thumb brushing against his father's sleeve. Noah stayed in Trevor's orbit, but even he occasionally darted a glance at Ethan, as if testing the air between them. And Ethan sat there, heart pounding, trying to memorize it all, the sound of his son's laughter, the shape of Sophie's half-smile, the weight of this moment that felt both ordinary and momentous. When Trevor finally stood to leave, his smile was smooth, practiced. "I'll be in touch," he told Sophie, glancing briefly at Ethan. "It was good to meet you, Ethan." Ethan rose, holding his gaze, the tightness in his chest loosening only when the door clicked shut behind Trevor. For a long moment the apartment was quiet. Then Sophie let out a breath, pressing a hand to her forehead. "That went better than I expected." Ethan looked at her, something raw flickering across his face. "Did it?" Sophie stepped closer, her voice softening. "They love you, Ethan. They just don't know how to show it yet." "I don't know how to show it either," Ethan murmured, his voice low, rough around the edges. Sophie's hand brushed his arm, just barely, and the contact sent a flicker of heat racing under his skin. "You're here," she said quietly. "That's a start." Ethan held her gaze, the tension between them shifting, something old and fragile giving way to something new, unsteady, and full of possibility. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure what came next, and for the first time he wanted to stay and find out. The night after Trevor's visit, the apartment settled into an uneasy stillness. Sophie sat on the couch, absently folding a small mountain of tiny t-shirts and superhero pajamas, her fingers moving mechanically as her mind drifted elsewhere. Across the room, Ethan stood by the window, the glow of the city casting sharp angles across his face. Neither of them spoke. The only sound was the occasional creak of the old floorboards and the soft hum of the boys breathing in the next room. Finally, Sophie broke the silence. "He called me afterward." Ethan turned slightly, his silhouette tense against the window. "Trevor." Sophie nodded, pressing a hand to her forehead. "He said he's going to talk to a lawyer." She let out a shaky breath. "He wants formal visitation." Ethan's jaw clenched, his shoulders squaring. "Of course he does." Sophie looked up sharply. "Ethan, I told you this would happen." He cut in, his voice low, controlled. "I told you the second he sensed I was here, he'd come crawling out of the woodwork." Her eyes flared with quiet anger. "He didn't crawl out of the woodwork, Ethan. He showed up when no one else did." Ethan's breath caught, the words hitting deeper than she probably meant them to. Sophie saw it, the flicker of pain that passed across his face before he masked it again. She softened slightly, dropping the folded t-shirt into the basket. "I'm not defending him," she said, her voice gentler. "I'm just trying to figure out how to protect the boys." Ethan crossed the room, stopping just short of her, his voice quiet but charged. "You think I'm not trying to protect them?" Sophie tilted her chin up, meeting his gaze. "I think you're used to fighting with money and power, Ethan. And this is different." He let out a bitter breath, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know any other way, Sophie. That's what I'm telling you." She stared at him, her heart tightening. For a moment, he looked less like the polished man she'd known, the one who strode through boardrooms like he owned them, and more like the man she'd once loved, raw and unguarded, standing in front of her without answers. "I know," she whispered. Their eyes held. Something fragile, something old and unfinished, something that scared them both. The boys stirred in the next room, a soft rustle, a sleepy murmur. Sophie broke away first, moving quietly down the hall. Ethan watched her go, his chest tight, his hands clenched uselessly at his sides. The next morning, The apartment was quieter than usual. Ethan sat at the table with Liam, helping him piece together a puzzle, while Sophie moved through the kitchen, making breakfast with a distracted air. Noah darted around the room, occasionally crashing into his brother with a delighted squeal. Maria arrived mid-morning, her eyes flicking between Ethan and Sophie as she set down a grocery bag. She moved with practiced grace, sweeping up toys, humming softly to herself. As she passed by Ethan, she paused, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Señor Cole," she murmured in Spanish, "a man's worth is measured in what he stays for, not what he walks away from." Ethan looked up, startled, but Maria was already moving on, gathering up a pile of socks from under the couch. Later, after Maria left and the boys were napping, Ethan found Sophie on the balcony, arms folded against the late spring breeze. He joined her quietly, standing just close enough to feel the edge of her warmth. "I talked to my lawyer," he said softly. Sophie stiffened. "I'm not trying to take them from you," Ethan murmured. I want to be sure Trevor doesn't." She exhaled, pressing a hand to her mouth. "This wasn't supposed to get this complicated." Ethan gave a soft, humorless laugh. "Welcome to my life." Sophie turned toward him, eyes shining, voice trembling just slightly. "Ethan, I'm scared. I'm scared we're going to break something that's already been patched together too many times." His breath hitched. Without thinking, his hand brushed her arm, a tentative touch, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed. "I'm scared too," he said quietly. For a long moment they stood there, two people trying to find their footing on ground that had shifted beneath them. Inside, the boys stirred, their laughter drifting through the open window, cutting through the tension like sunlight. Sophie let out a shaky breath, a small, reluctant smile tugging at her lips. "We're a mess." Ethan's mouth curved into a faint, crooked smile. "Yeah," he murmured, "but we're a mess together." And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough to keep standing. The summons came on a rainy Thursday morning. Sophie sat at the kitchen table, phone pressed to her ear, her shoulders pulled tight as piano wire. Across the room, Ethan paced near the window, watching gray streaks of rain slide down the glass. His stomach knotted. When Sophie ended the call, she didn't look at him right away. She set the phone down carefully, as if it might crack under the weight of what it carried. "He filed," she said quietly. Ethan felt the words sink into his chest like cold stones. "Trevor's petition is official. He wants formal visitation, and he's contesting paternity." Ethan turned sharply. "What?" "He's asking for a DNA test," Sophie whispered. "He's saying that until it's proven, the boys shouldn't be kept from him." Ethan swore under his breath, raking a hand through his hair. For a moment, he wanted to punch something. His lawyer, the wall, the smug, polished memory of Trevor's grin at the door. Instead, he pulled in a breath and pressed his palm flat against the window, forcing himself to think. "We'll fight it," Ethan murmured. "I have the best legal team in the city. We'll handle this." But when he turned, Sophie was watching him, her arms wrapped tight across her chest, her face pale with something deeper than anger. "I don't want to fight like this," she said, her voice raw. "Not in a courtroom. Not with the boys caught in the middle." Ethan crossed the room, stopping just short of touching her. His heart hammered against his ribs. "You think I do?" Sophie let out a shaky laugh. "Number. But this isn't a hostile takeover, Ethan. This is our life. Their life." He reached for her then, tentative, his hand brushing her forearm. She didn't pull away, but her eyes shimmered with uncertainty. "I'm scared," Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm scared we're all going to lose in this." For a moment, Ethan forgot how to speak. In the boardroom, In business, he was a master of control. But standing here, with the woman he'd once walked away from and the two little boys he hadn't known existed, his control was unraveling, and part of him knew. Maybe it needed to. "Sophie," he said softly, "I'm not walking away again." Her eyes locked on his, wary and hopeful all at once. "I don't care what the DNA test says," Ethan went on. "I don't care what Trevor says. I'm here and I'm staying." For a long moment, Sophie just looked at him, searching, weighing, trying to measure the gap between the man she remembered and the one standing in front of her. And then, quietly, she whispered, "I need you to mean that." Ethan swallowed hard. "I do." That evening after dinner, the apartment settled into a rare quiet. Ethan sat cross-legged on the living room floor, Liam curled against his side with a book, Noah sprawled on his stomach, crayon in hand. Across the room, Sophie leaned in the doorway, arms folded, watching them with an expression Ethan couldn't quite read, something soft, something haunted, something quietly breaking open. "Nick?" Liam murmured, glancing up with wide, searching eyes. "Yeah, buddy? Are you my dad?" Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. He set the book down carefully, smoothing a hand over Liam's dark curls. His voice was low, rough-edged when he spoke. "I didn't know you existed," he said softly. "If I had, I would have been here sooner. But yes, I'm your dad." Liam was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned his head against Ethan's shoulder, small and warm and steady. Across the room, Sophie pressed her hand to her mouth, blinking fast. Later, when the boys were asleep, Sophie found Ethan on the balcony, the night wind tugging at his sleeves. She stepped out quietly, wrapping her arms around herself. "I watched you tonight," she murmured. "With them." Ethan turned, his face shadowed in the dim light. "You're trying so hard," Sophie whispered. "I see it." He huffed a soft laugh, shaking his head. "I'm terrified, Sophie." She smiled faintly, stepping closer. "Good. That means you care." For a moment they stood together, the city stretching out below them, the hum of cars and distant music drifting up like a promise. And for the first time since everything had turned upside down, Ethan felt a strange, quiet peace settle in his chest. Not because they were safe, or certain, or fixed, but because at last they were facing the storm together. The courthouse was colder than Ethan expected. Even in his tailored suit, even with the confident stride that once commanded boardrooms, something about the polished marble floors, the echo of hurried footsteps, and the low murmur of voices tightened around his chest like a vice. He sat beside Sophie on the hard bench outside the courtroom, his hands clasped loosely between his knees. Across from them, Trevor leaned against the wall, all smooth smiles and expensive cologne, flipping casually through his phone as though this were just another brunch reservation. Sophie was stiff beside Ethan, her fingers woven tightly together, knuckles white. She hadn't spoken much on the drive here, but the way her foot tapped restlessly on the floor betrayed the storm churning just beneath her careful mask. "You don't have to be here," Sophie murmured, glancing at Ethan from the corner of her eye. He turned to her, his jaw tight. "Yes, I do." For a moment her lips pressed together, and then, almost too soft to hear, she said, "Thank you." The bailiff called their names. As they stepped inside, Ethan felt a strange sensation ripple through him. Not fear exactly, not even anger, but something rawer, something older. The weight of choices long past and the undeniable need to finally, irrevocably, stand still. The hearing was formal, clinical, the kind of thing Ethan usually excelled at. But this wasn't business. This was personal. The judge, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a no-nonsense air, listened carefully as Trevor's attorney laid out his case. Trevor had been in the boys' lives. He had offered support. He had been present. Ethan's attorney countered. Trevor was not their biological father. He had no legal standing. Sophie spoke next. Ethan watched her as she rose, watched the way she smoothed her skirt, squared her shoulders, took a long breath before facing the bench. "I don't want to erase anyone," she said quietly, "but I want stability for my boys, and he's their father." Trevor bristled. "A father who was absent for 6 years?" Ethan stood. His voice was calm, quieter than anyone expected. "You're right," he said, eyes locked on Trevor. "I was absent. I didn't know they existed. But the moment I did, I showed up, and I've been here every day since." He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping to Sophie, then back to the judge. "Money doesn't make a father, but neither does proximity. What matters is staying, showing up when it's hard, and I will stay every day for the rest of my life, if they'll let me." The courtroom was silent. Even Trevor looked momentarily off balance, his lips pressing into a thin line. The judge tapped her pen against the desk, eyes thoughtful, then recessed to chambers. Ethan sank onto the bench, his hands trembling just slightly. Sophie sat beside him, her shoulders brushing his. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. It was almost an hour later when the judge returned. Her ruling was clear. Trevor would have no formal visitation rights. Ethan's paternity would be established through the agreed-upon test. But until then, Ethan would retain shared legal custody as the children's biological father. Outside the courtroom, Trevor paused, glancing back toward Sophie with something halfway between regret and wounded pride. "I cared about them," he murmured. Sophie nodded quietly. "I know." And just like that, he walked away. That night, the apartment was filled with the low hum of television and the scent of leftover pizza. Ethan stood by the window, watching the boys as they tumbled around the living room, a flurry of giggles and dinosaur pajamas. Sophie came up beside him, folding her arms across her chest. "I didn't think you had that in you," she murmured, half a smile ghosting across her lips. Ethan let out a soft breath, shaking his head. "Neither did I." She turned, studying him quietly. "You're different, you know." He glanced at her, something raw and unfamiliar flickering across his face. "I want to be." For a long moment they stood there in the soft glow of lamplight, the quiet between them rich with things unspoken. Then, unexpectedly, Sophie leaned in, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. Ethan froze, the sharp edges of his chest softening as he let his cheek brush the top of her hair, the smallest breath of peace settling between them. In the chaos, in the storm, they had chosen to stay. And sometimes Ethan was beginning to understand that was where love truly began. The days after the hearing felt like walking on thin ice. The apartment was quiet in a way that made Ethan restless. Trevor was gone, the court battle was over, and yet a tension lingered, unspoken but heavy. Ethan sat at the kitchen table one evening, laptop open but ignored, watching as Sophie moved around the small living room. She was folding the boys' clothes into neat piles, humming faintly to herself, but her shoulders were tight, her movements mechanical. Liam and Noah were already in bed, their laughter fading into soft whispers behind the closed bedroom door. "Sophie," Ethan said quietly. She didn't look up. "Talk to me," he added, his voice gentler. She froze for a heartbeat, then set the folded t-shirt down and crossed her arms over her chest, leaning back against the couch. Her eyes were tired, her face pale with something he couldn't quite name. "I should be relieved," she murmured. "We should be celebrating." Ethan rose slowly, walking toward her. "But," she let out a breath, shaking her head. "But I'm scared, Ethan, that this was just the easy part." He frowned. The court battle was the easy part? She gave a small, hollow laugh. It's one thing to win custody. It's another to build a life that works. With you, with the boys, with everything we left undone between us. Ethan's chest tightened. He reached up, rubbing the back of his neck. Sophie, She lifted a hand, stopping him. I know you're trying. I see it every day. But I also see how hard this is for you. You're used to being in charge, to fixing things. And you can't fix this with money or charm or good intentions. Her words struck deep, not cruel, but true. I don't want to fix it, Ethan said quietly. I just want to be in it. Sophie's eyes shimmered, and for a second she looked like she might cry, but then she pulled in a shaky breath, straightened her spine, and gave him a look that was equal parts affection and warning. Then you have to be ready for the messy parts, Ethan. For the late nights, the meltdowns, the doubts, the days when you'll feel like you're failing. He nodded slowly, his throat tightening around words he didn't quite know how to say. Across the apartment, the boy's door creaked open, and Noah peeked out, clutching a stuffed dinosaur. Nick, he whispered, eyes wide. My nightlight stopped working. Ethan moved without thinking, crouching down to Noah's height. Hey, buddy, let's go fix it together. Sophie watched from the couch as Ethan scooped Noah into his arms, the little boy winding his arms around Ethan's neck without hesitation. It was a small moment, but it was everything. Later that night, after the boys were asleep and the apartment had gone still, Ethan stood on the balcony, the city stretched out before him in a sea of glittering lights. Sophie joined him quietly, slipping a cardigan over her shoulders. She leaned against the railing, their arms just barely brushing. I used to stand here at night and feel like the city was mine, Ethan murmured, his voice rough. Now it just feels loud. Sophie gave a small smile, her gaze soft. You used to think the world ended at the skyline. He huffed a quiet laugh. Yeah. They were silent for a beat, the cool night air wrapping around them. You know, Sophie said softly, I was angry for a long time. Angry that you left. Angry that you didn't come back. Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the horizon. And then, she continued, I realized that maybe you didn't know how to come back. He turned slowly, his face shadowed in the dim light. I didn't, he admitted. I barely know now. Sophie's lips curved into the faintest, saddest smile. But you're here. He reached out then, almost without thinking, his fingers brushing hers where they rested on the railing. She didn't pull away. For a moment they stood like that, two people standing on the edge of something fragile and new, the wreckage of the past behind them, and the uncertain shape of the future ahead. I'm here, Ethan whispered. And this time, Sophie let herself believe it. The rain started just after midnight. Ethan stood at the boys' bedroom door, one hand resting lightly against the frame, listening to the soft rhythm of Liam and Noah's breathing. In the dim glow of the hallway light, he could see the shape of their small bodies curled under mismatched blankets, the faint rise and fall of their chests, the way Liam's hand stretched out instinctively toward his brother even in sleep. He should have felt peace, but instead, the words Sophie had spoken on the balcony hours ago circled in his mind like a restless tide. Maybe you didn't know how to come back. She was right. And now that he was here, he wasn't sure if he knew how to stay. The next morning, the apartment buzzed with quiet tension. Ethan had barely touched his coffee. Sophie moved around the kitchen, preparing breakfast with a distracted air. The boys chased each other in circles around the couch, their laughter sharp and high-pitched, cutting through the thick quiet between the adults. Then the knock came, a firm, confident knock at the door. Sophie stiffened. Ethan shot to his feet, heart hammering. Maria, their steady, no-nonsense housekeeper, peeked in from the hallway where she'd been gathering laundry. "Do you want me to?" "No," Ethan said quickly, already striding to the door. When he swung it open, he found a woman standing on the threshold. She was tall, elegantly dressed in a pale trench coat, her dark hair swept into a sleek twist. Her expression was cool, but her eyes flickered with something Ethan immediately recognized: calculated curiosity. "Mr. Cole," she said smoothly, offering a card. "I'm Dana Layton from the Sentinel. I was hoping to ask a few questions." Sophie appeared behind him, pale and tense. "What is this?" Ethan felt something primal tighten in his chest. "We're not giving statements," he said sharply, already pushing the door closed. But Dana smiled, sharp, knowing. "Public interest is climbing, Mr. Cole. Absent billionaire, hidden family, a custody battle. You can't think this story won't get out." Ethan's jaw worked. "We have nothing to say." Dana's eyes flicked briefly to Sophie, then past them, where Liam and Noah were peeking around the corner, wide-eyed. "I understand," she murmured. "But when you're ready, people will want to hear your side." The door clicked shut. Ethan stood there, his chest heaving, fingers pressed to the cool wood. Behind him, Sophie's voice was a low, shaky whisper. "Is this what we have to look forward to now?" He turned, raking a hand through his hair. "I can handle it." Sophie's eyes flashed. "That's just it, Ethan. You can't control this." "I can protect you," he insisted. Sophie let out a soft, broken laugh. "No, Ethan, you can stand with me, you can show up, but you can't protect us from the fallout of a life you built when we weren't part of it." The words cut deep. For a long moment they stood there in the quiet, the boys' whispers and giggles a distant echo, the rain tapping against the window like a reminder of everything fragile between them. Finally, Ethan's shoulders sagged. "I'm scared," he murmured, voice raw. "Not of the press, not of Trevor, not even of failing in court. I'm scared of failing you, of failing them."